In 1980, a 12-year-old girl named Emily Harper left home on her red bicycle and never rang the bell at school. No body, no witness, just the sound of tires on gravel, then silence. For decades, folks said she must have run off, or worse. But 45 years later, a spring storm unearthed something beneath an old barn on the edge of town. Not a body, a shelter. And inside it, the truth no one wanted to believe. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Clara Harper. I'm 42 now, but the story I'm about to tell you began long before I was born in a town that never liked too many questions. I grew up in Briar Ridge, Arkansas. It's a quiet place tucked between low hills and old cotton fields, the kind of town where porches creak, dogs sleep in the road, and the church bell still rings at noon. Folks wave when they pass, even if they don't like you. Back then, life moved slow, and that was fine by us. We weren't rich, but things felt steady, normal. My dad Daniel worked at the grain mill most of his life. My mom taught Sunday school until her health gave out. We lived in a small brick house on Sycamore Lane. Nothing fancy, just home. I remember playing in the front yard with a plastic bat, riding my bike through puddles, catching fireflies in a peanut butter jar. Our world was small, but it felt safe. What I didn't know, what none of us kids knew, was that there was a name we weren't supposed to say too loud. Emily Harper. She was my dad's sister, my aunt. But nobody ever called her that. It was like she belonged to some other lifetime. There was a faded photograph in an old frame tucked behind other pictures on the hallway shelf. A girl with a ribbon in her hair and a crooked smile standing next to a red bike. When I asked about her once, my dad just said, "She's gone now," and left the room. Even when I got older, folks only talked about her in half sentences. That poor family, they'd say. Terrible thing would happen back then. Then they'd look away. Briar Ridge has a way of folding in on itself, covering what doesn't fit the picture. After a while, even I stopped asking. Years passed. I moved 3 states away, built a life in Missouri, tried not to think about the town that never seemed to change. I hadn't been back in over a decade, not for Christmas, not even when my mother passed. But then this past spring, I got a call from Dad's assisted living center. He'd had a stroke. They weren't sure he'd come back from it. So I drove down. 12 hours on the road, nothing but old country stations and silence. The minute I crossed the county line and saw that chipped "Welcome to Briar Ridge" sign, something in my chest tightened. It was smaller than I remembered. The paint was peeling. Vines had crept up the post like the land itself was trying to swallow it. I pulled up to the house on Sycamore. The lawn was knee-high, the porch swing barely hanging on its frayed rope. Inside, the smell of antiseptic hung in the air. Dad was sleeping in a rented hospital bed near the TV. He looked hollow, smaller than I remembered. Marcy Benson, our old neighbor, was in the kitchen. She'd been checking on him every day, bringing meals, sorting his mail. We hugged. She looked at me with this long, quiet sadness. Later that night, I started going through the old mail piled on the table, mostly bills and insurance forms. But near the bottom was something folded and yellowed, a clipping from the Briar Ridge Sentinel. April 1980. The headline read, "Young girl missing, police continue search for Emily Harper." I held it in my hands for a long time. My aunt. My blood, just 12 years old when she disappeared. I'd seen this headline before once as a teenager. But this time, something felt different. The house felt colder, the silence heavier. That night, just before bed, my dad stirred. His eyes opened and locked on mine. For the first time in days, he spoke just one word. "Emily." I sat down beside him. "What about her?" His brow furrowed. His voice cracked barely more than a whisper. "She saw the shelter." Then he slipped back into sleep. I didn't know what he meant. I didn't even know there was a shelter. But in my gut, I felt it. The first shift, like something underneath this town had started to turn. And that was the night I stopped pretending Briar Ridge was just a quiet little place I used to call home. He said it like it was nothing, just a passing word from a broken mind slipping in and out of time. She saw the shelter. I sat in the dark for a long time after that. I didn't sleep. I don't even think I blinked. The next morning I stepped out into the gray light and walked. The streets of Briar Ridge still looked the same. Same cracked sidewalks, same crooked street signs, same rusted-out Coke machine buzzing outside the gas station. It was like the whole town had been sealed in place unmoved for decades. But something about it felt different to me now. I passed the school Emily's school back when it was called Briar Ridge Middle. It's been repainted, but the bones are the same. The bell still hangs over the main entrance. I stood under it and stared at the memorial plaque bolted just below, in memory of Emily Harper. Gone, but not forgotten. The wood had warped over time, and someone had scratched a line beneath the lettering. It read, "Forgotten after all." I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I let it out. Back at the house, my father was awake again, though not for long. He couldn't say much, just fragments, but every so often his eyes would lock onto mine like he was trying to tell me something without speaking. I kept hearing that word in my head, shelter. I didn't even know where to start, so I drove down to the library. Mrs. Whitlock was still there, older, now a little slower, but sharp as ever. When I told her who I was, she put her hand to her heart and said, "Your aunt had the kindest soul. She loved books, always finished early and asked for more." I asked if the newspaper archives were still kept on microfilm. She nodded toward the back room and said, "Everything's back there. Just ask if the reader jams, it's a little touchy." I spent the better part of the afternoon scanning old articles from 1980. The early ones were frantic community search efforts, school closures, police statements. They faded quickly. By mid-May, the updates stopped. One final article, maybe 100 words long, noted that the case remained open, no new leads. It felt like watching the town exhale and turn away. That night, as I stepped out into the evening air, something sharp cracked in the distance. I thought it was thunder, but it was deeper than that an impact. A storm had swept through the far end of town, and a tree, one of the old oaks out by Miller Farm, had come down hard. The next morning, I saw the headline on my phone while drinking coffee that Marcy had left on the stovetop. "Storm exposes hidden structure beneath Miller Barn." A demolition crew had found a sealed chamber concrete reinforced with a rusted steel hatch. I drove out there before breakfast. It was already roped off with police tape. A crowd had formed, mostly older folks in lawn chairs, whispering too loud and sipping from thermoses. A man in a reflective vest spotted me, walked up, and asked, "You Clara Harper?" I hesitated. "Yes." "Why?" He pointed to a folding table under a pop-up tent. "We found something inside. Sheriff said someone might come looking." On that table, wrapped in plastic, was a red bicycle, rusted almost to dust, a partially intact school uniform, a small dented metal box sealed tight and marked with two faint initials, HH. I didn't need anyone to tell me what that meant. Emily Hope Harper. The man lowered his voice. "We think it might be her. The lab's still testing the remains." At the sheriff's office, they let me sit in when they opened the box. Sheriff Leah Collins handled it herself. She was calm, methodical. The way she spoke made you feel like nothing would catch her off guard. "We wanted you to be here," she said. "You're next of kin." Inside the box was a small diary, the vinyl cover cracked but still intact, a worn-down pencil, a photo of Emily standing beside her bike, and a heart-shaped locket with no chain. I picked up the photo. It had faded around the edges, but the image was clear. Emily was smiling. In the background, I could see our old house brighter then full of life. And something else. A figure standing half in shadow. I couldn't make it out, but there was a wide-brimmed hat and a stain, maybe a birthmark on the back of the left hand. I scanned it and sent it to myself. Underneath, I typed, "Who is this?" That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying my father's words. She saw something. The shelter. And now, here it was. Buried beneath a collapsed barn. Sheriff Collins called me 2 days later. The remains were confirmed Emily Harper. After 45 years, the missing person case was officially a homicide investigation. They had also managed to preserve the first few pages of the diary. The rest was still being handled by forensics, but Collins let me see what had come through so far. I remember the weight of the folder in my hands. There were only 8 printed pages scanned from the originals. Some were faded, others nearly perfect. The handwriting was small, neat, a little wobbly. The first entry was dated April 12, 1980. I didn't go to school. I had to turn around. I saw something bad behind Miller Barn. Men loading barrels into a hole. It smelled awful. Rotten eggs and chemicals. I think one of them saw me. I hid. I dropped my pencil case. I'm scared. I'm writing this in the old shelter. It's cold down here. There's no food. Maybe someone will find me. I read it out loud, slowly. The room was quiet. Sheriff Collins was still and focused, but I could feel something shift between us, like we'd both crossed into something we couldn't walk back from. The second entry named someone. I think the man who followed me was Mr. Riggs. He teaches gym. His truck has a dent in the door. I heard him later near the barn. They said if she talks, it's over. I don't think they left. I looked up. Mr. Riggs. He taught at the school. Collins nodded. Still alive. Retired now. Lives by the river. I kept reading. Each page sank deeper. April 15th. She thought someone knew she was down there. I heard footsteps on the hatch. I yelled. They didn't open it. They just stood there. Then they left. I could barely finish that line. Collins spoke quietly. Judging by markings on the wall and initial reports, she survived at least a week. Maybe more. No signs of trauma. No struggle. She wasn't taken violently. She waited. Later that afternoon, I visited the shelter with one of the deputies, Ethan Rhodes. He handed me a flashlight and led me down the short staircase. The air was thick, old damp, heavy with the kind of stillness that only settles in places long forgotten. The walls were wood-paneled. There were scratch marks low near the floor. In the corner, writing, etched with something dull. April 18th. Still no one. Cold, trying to be brave. I had to sit down on the step. The idea of her being down here so close to home while the world moved on above her was almost too much to hold. Ethan didn't say much, just stood there with his light on the wall. Someone locked her in, he said, and never came back. When I got home, I told Marcy. She covered her mouth and whispered, "She was right there. All these years." I nodded. Sheriff thinks someone used the storm shelter to hide her. Maybe they panicked. Maybe they meant to come back. That night, I looked at the photo again. The one from the box. The figure in the background, the hat, the birthmark, the way he stood. It wasn't anyone I recognized. But he was close to the house. Close enough to know where she'd gone. I zoomed in and stared at the face just enough to blur it more. That's when a memory surfaced, something I hadn't thought of in years. A Sunday school journal Emily kept in '77. My dad once told me it went missing not long before she disappeared. No one ever found it. Until now. Or maybe someone did. I didn't know what I expected walking into the sheriff's office with Emily's diary pages in my hand. Maybe I thought it would shift everything, that they'd move faster, dig deeper, turn the whole town upside down. But Sheriff Collins just nodded slow and measured and said, "We'll take it from here." She wasn't dismissive exactly, but there was a finality to it, like that was the end of what I needed to know, like this was now official business and I should go home. Instead, I sat in my car with the engine running and stared at the courthouse clock for a long time. The truth was, I didn't know how to stop. Not after reading Emily's last words. Not after seeing how close she came to surviving. I drove past the school again, past the creek, past the edge of Miller Farm. The barn was gone now, just a flattened skeleton of wood and rusted nails. Yellow tape still flapped in the breeze, but no one stood watch anymore. I parked just beyond the tree line and walked the edge of the property. Nothing moved except the wind through the weeds. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It felt held in. Back at the house, I tried to show my father the photo again, the one with the blurred figure in the background, but his eyes just drifted past it. He was awake, but not really there. I said, "Dad, do you remember who this could be? The man behind Emily." He looked at me for a long while, then closed his eyes. I sat beside him until the machines beeped too long without rhythm and a nurse asked me to give him space. I went into the kitchen and pulled out every old folder, drawer, and shoebox I could find. Bills, church programs, a thank you letter from the city council in 1981. Then at the bottom of a plastic crate marked taxes, I found a manila envelope labeled Permit Soil Storage Miller Farm, 1980. My hands stilled. Inside were copies of 2 forms. One signed by Kenneth Voss, the former school principal. The other by Donald Harper, my grandfather. The same men Emily had written about. And at the bottom of the page, in light blue ink, almost faded to nothing, a third name, George W., Langston Creek Cleanup Supervisor. I circled it. Then I picked up the town directory from beside the phone and flipped through. Langston George W. Still in town. Still alive. Still listed at a trailer out on Cemetery Road. I made the drive just before dusk. Mount Olive Baptist Church stood just a few blocks from the trailer park. I hadn't stepped inside since I was a kid. It looked different now, like something that had stood too long in the sun. The white paint had peeled back in strips. The welcome sign tilted toward the gravel lot like it was tired. But the inside was just as I remembered. Still. Wooden pews lined in perfect rows. The altar draped in faded red cloth. The smell of dust and lemon oil mixed together, same as always. A young man was vacuuming near the back. When he saw me, he switched the machine off and asked if I needed help. I told him I was looking for Deacon Langston. He hesitated. Said Langston didn't come around much anymore. Health issues. Health. Then he gave me an address. Blue mailbox by the pines, he said. Before I left, I asked, "Is that the old pastor's study?" I pointed toward the door with the frosted glass. He nodded. "It's mostly storage now." I asked if I could look. He shrugged. "Just don't take anything." The room was small and still smelled like pipe tobacco. Bookshelves lined the walls. Mostly theology texts, hymnals, a few Sunday school records. On the desk was a photo, 3 men in suits on the church steps. My grandfather, Kenneth Voss, and the third, I guessed, was George Langston. I moved around the room, running my hand along the shelves, when I noticed one floorboard was loose near the heater, just slightly raised. I pulled it up. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed but intact. The handwriting was childlike but neat. "If anyone finds this..." April 16th. It was signed with a simple E. I unfolded it carefully. I heard Mr. Langston arguing outside. He said the girl is a problem that needs solving. I know it was him. He talks loud. He said, "We already buried enough truth. One more won't matter." I drove straight to the trailer. The sun was low, the sky pale and quiet. The place looked like it hadn't seen visitors in years. The grass was high. A plastic wind chime hung still on the porch. I knocked twice. Nothing. I turned to leave when the door creaked open. An old man stood in the doorway in a flannel robe. His face was drawn, his frame bent. But his eyes were clear. "I know who you are," he said. I nodded. "Then you know why I'm here." He stepped back. "Come in." The inside smelled like liniment and old paper. He pointed to a chair across from a sagging recliner. I sat. "I have a letter," I said. "Emily heard you at the church." He didn't respond, just looked at the floor. "You helped bury waste in the creek." I continued. "You helped cover it up, and you were going to kill her." At that, he looked up. "I never touched that girl," he said, voice steady, "but I didn't stop the ones who did." I waited. "Your grandfather, Voss, Riggs, and Pastor Whitmore. We all knew what the barrels were. Industrial waste, military contract, no money for disposal. They buried it." He looked toward the window. She saw. "Emily. Too much. We thought maybe if she stayed quiet we could fix it. But she wrote everything down." He paused. "I didn't know she was starving. Not at first. When I heard her voice through the concrete, I thought they'd told her to wait there for safety. I didn't know they'd left her." "You heard her," I said, "and walked away." His eyes closed. "Yes." I stood. "I'm taking the letter to the sheriff. I'll give them your name." He nodded. "That's why I saved this." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a photograph. Emily again, this time standing beside Pastor Harold Whitmore. "Ask him," Langston said. "Ask why she trusted him enough to go to that farm in the first place." I took the photo and stepped back into the night. The air was thick and the wind had picked up. I stood there for a minute, the picture trembling in my hand, and looked toward the old steeple in the distance. Mount Olive stood still in the dark, but I knew someone was awake inside. I had no proof, just a name and a face, but somehow that was enough to keep me walking. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because I already knew which door I'd be knocking on next. I waited until early morning to drive back to the church. The gravel lot was still damp from the night's rain, and the clouds hadn't cleared yet. Everything looked muted, washed out, like the building itself was holding its breath. The sanctuary doors were open just slightly, and there was a faint glow from inside. I stepped in quietly. The old wood underfoot creaked in that familiar way. It wasn't just memory, I knew this place. I'd sat in these pews as a child, watched light spill through these same windows, and yet standing there now, it felt like I was seeing the church from the wrong side of something. The photo Langston gave me was in my pocket, Emily smiling. And beside her, Pastor Harold Whitmore, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder like they were family. I hadn't seen him in years, not since long before my mother passed. I didn't even know if he was still preaching. But there he was, behind the pulpit, adjusting a stack of hymnals. He looked thinner, older than I remembered. But his eyes were the same calm, steady, almost too calm. He looked up and said, "You've got Harper eyes." I stepped closer. "You knew Emily," I said. He nodded once. I baptized her myself. She used to sit in that second row with her ribbon tied too tight, always off key when she sang. I pulled the photo from my pocket and handed it to him. "Then you know this picture. You were there, and you were the one who told her to go to the Miller property, weren't you?" His shoulders stiffened just slightly. Then he lowered himself to the edge of the pulpit step. It took him a moment to answer. "She came to me the day before she disappeared," he said. She told me she'd seen something barrels men near the creek, something about a smell. She said she didn't feel safe going to her parents. I told her. I told her we'd go together, just to look. I thought if I could show her it was nothing, she'd feel better. She was only 12. His hands were clasped in front of him now, rubbing the edge of one thumb with the other. I stayed where I was, close enough to hear, far enough to see him clearly. And when you got there, I asked. We saw them, he said. Langston, your grandfather Riggs. They were unloading something large barrels. They noticed us. I told Emily to hide. I didn't know what else to do. I thought they'd just explain it away, that it was fertilizer or some farm waste. But then they came toward me angry, saying things about town budgets and government contracts. They said if I talked, I'd ruin more than just them. Did you believe them? I asked. He paused. No. But I didn't know how deep it went. I didn't think they'd do what they did. I stepped forward. Did you know she was alive in that shelter? Did you know they left her there? His eyes lifted slowly. Not at first. Not until years later. Langston let it slip one night after too many drinks. Said he heard her crying through the hatch. I didn't believe him. I didn't want to. But you stayed quiet, I said. All these years. He nodded. I tried to write it all down once. I thought maybe if I left it in a letter, someone would come forward. But the church board caught wind of it. They said if I spoke, they'd bury me too. And by then the silence was so thick I didn't know how to cut through it. I reached into my bag and pulled out the scan of Emily's final diary page. I laid it on the pulpit. He leaned forward slowly, his fingers hovering just above the paper. His lips moved as he read. I remember that ribbon, he whispered. The one with the white dots. I stood for a moment, then turned to leave. You're going to speak to the sheriff, I said. And if you don't, I will. Outside, the clouds had started to break. I didn't go straight back to the house. I walked behind the church, past the last row of gravestones, and toward the old maintenance shed tucked beneath a stand of trees. Something about it pulled at me. The door was cracked. Inside it smelled like earth and motor oil. Gardening tools lined the far wall, and in the corner was a wooden box covered with a tarp. When I lifted it, I found old church ledgers, faded donation records, and beneath them, Emily's missing Sunday school journal from 1977, the one no one ever found. I sat with it for a moment in the doorway. It was warped and soft at the edges, but her name was still written on the cover in blue ink, underlined twice. By Sunday, word had spread. That morning, the sanctuary was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Some came out of curiosity, others because they already knew. Sheriff Collins stood near the back, arms folded. Pastor Harold sat in the front pew, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't speak. He didn't move. I stepped forward, not to the pulpit, but to the floor just below it, the same place where Emily once stood to sing with the other children. I took a breath. My name is Clara Harper. Some of you knew my father, Daniel. Fewer of you knew my aunt, Emily. But you've heard the story. A girl went missing in 1980. The search came up empty. The town moved on. But now we know more. I held up the diary pages. 2 weeks ago, during the storm, a shelter was uncovered under Miller Farm. Inside was her bicycle, her clothes, and her remains. She didn't run away. She didn't get lost. She saw something men dumping toxic waste into the creek. She tried to tell someone. Instead of being protected, she was silenced. I let the room settle. My grandfather, Principal Voss, Deacon Langston, Pastor Whitmore, they all played a part. And this town let the story end before it ever began. But she left us this. I placed the diary page on the podium and stepped to the side table where I'd brought the old school bell that used to hang in her classroom. It was rusted chipped, but it still rang. I struck it once. A clear, sharp tone echoed through the sanctuary. Not loud, just enough. Just long enough to make sure everyone heard it. Afterward, people came up in small groups. Some spoke, some didn't. A few left flowers on the steps. Sheriff Collins said the investigation was active, the charges were coming. That night, I went back to the shelter. Others came too. They brought candles, notes, photos. By sundown, there was a line of flickering light stretching from the tree line to the old foundation. I placed the diary pages beside the flowers and stood in silence. "She didn't run away," I said. "She was brave, and we let her die." A voice behind me spoke quiet, uncertain. She saved more than she knew. I turned. It was Robbie Taylor. His parents had lived near the creek. He'd battled cancer as a child, one of several kids diagnosed within a narrow stretch of years. Doctors said I was lucky, he said. But maybe it wasn't just luck. I nodded. Maybe it was her. We didn't say anything else. We just stood there watching the wind move across the field, and for a moment the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. It felt like the beginning of something that couldn't be buried again. The day after the vigil, I drove to the county archives. I'd barely slept, but something about what Robbie said stayed with me like Emily's story wasn't just a tragedy. It was a thread, and it hadn't finished unraveling. The archives were kept in the basement of the old courthouse, down a cement stairwell that smelled like wet cardboard and old dust. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I signed in and gave the clerk my request, building permits and land use records tied to the Miller property from 1979 through 1981. He gave me a long look but said nothing, just pointed toward a shelf of labeled boxes. I pulled out anything marked council minutes or land commission reviews and started reading. Most of it was routine, boring, dry approvals for septic tanks and barn repairs. But then I found a permit filed in January 1980. It was labeled Temporary Soil Storage Use Parcel, number 1178 Miller Farm. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable Principal Kenneth Voss. But there was another line just beneath it. Co-sponsor Donald Harper Briar Ridge Town Council, my grandfather. I stared at the paper for a long time. The two men Emily had named in her diary, the ones Pastor Harold had confirmed were present at the creek. I snapped a photo of the form with my phone and kept digging. A second permit, dated just 2 months later, had one more name in the corner: Creek Cleanup Supervisor George Langston. There it was again. The same men, the same land, and now there was a paper trail. When I got home, my father was awake and lucid, at least for a little while. I sat beside him and told him what I'd found. He didn't look surprised. He just stared at the ceiling and said, "Your grandfather told them to stop asking questions. He said if Emily talked, it would all fall apart. I asked him if he knew about the shelter, if he'd known she was in there." His voice cracked when he said yes, but not right away, he whispered. They told him it was too late. He never forgave himself. That night, I pulled everything out onto the dining room table, every page from the diary, every permit scan, every photograph I'd collected since coming back. I drew lines between the names, dates, locations. One by one, I started circling the patterns. There were too many overlaps to ignore. But then, in the corner of one document I'd nearly missed, I saw a name that hadn't come up yet. Environmental Concern, filed April 15th, 1980, by Darlene Pritchard, 72 Ridge View Drive. I remembered the address. It was just down the road from the southern edge of the Miller property. The form was stamped Received. No follow-up required. Nothing else. No soil test. No home visit. Just silence. The next afternoon, I drove to the house. A woman in her 60s answered the door wearing a housecoat and slippers. Her eyes narrowed when I introduced myself. "Emily Harper's niece," I said. Her face softened, but only slightly. "I remember your aunt," she said after a long pause. I asked if she had filed the complaint back in 1980. She nodded. Strong chemical odor, she said. Animals got sick. Chickens stopped laying. 2 goats died. I sent the letter, but no one came. I asked if anyone from the town had followed up. She looked at me directly. Your grandfather came by, brought a bag of feed, told me it was all a misunderstanding, said they were just doing repairs near the creek, promised it wouldn't affect anything. She shook her head. Next week my hens were dead and your aunt was gone. I asked her if she thought it was connected. I know it was, she said quietly. But after Emily disappeared, the whole town got quiet. Like fear settled in over everything. Before I left, she put a hand on my arm. You be careful, she said. They're not all dead yet. That evening, someone left a brown envelope at the front door. No return address. Inside was a photocopy of a 1980 town council roster with 3 names circled in red ink: Voss, Harper, and Riggs. Beneath the list, someone had written in shaky handwriting, "Ask who cleaned up the creek in '81. Start there." I didn't recognize the handwriting, but the message was clear. This wasn't just about a little girl who saw too much. It was about what the town chose to bury after she disappeared. The next morning, I drove to the diner just after sunrise. Bill Mercer, the retired hardware store owner and cousin to Kenneth Voss, was sitting in his usual booth. I slid into the seat across from him without asking. He looked up over his glasses, didn't seem surprised. "You're stirring ghosts," he said. "I'm telling the truth," I said back. "That's the problem with the truth," he muttered. "It doesn't care who it buries." I asked him if he knew about the creek that permits the shelter. He didn't answer directly, just sipped his coffee and said, "There's a reason nobody asked too many questions back then. This town wasn't built on secrets. It was built on silence." As I stepped outside, the sun had just cleared the trees. A dark green pickup rolled up beside me at the crosswalk. The passenger window slid down. The driver wore sunglasses and a camouflage cap. "You need to stop asking questions," he said. His voice was flat, practiced. "Excuse me," I said. "You heard me," he replied. Then the truck peeled away before I could catch the plate. I stood there a moment watching the dust settle. He hadn't said her name. He hadn't said mine. But he didn't have to. Back at the house, I checked my phone. Sheriff Collins had left a voicemail earlier that morning. Forensics had finished processing more of the diary. Additional pages were ready. As I listened, I glanced over at the photo I'd left on the windowsill, Emily standing by her bike, the man in the background still blurred by shadow. I picked it up and turned it toward the light, wondering what else it might still be trying to show me. There were still too many names with no accountability, too many records that ended in silence. But I knew now what to look for. And I knew exactly where to go next. I parked half a block from the river and sat with the engine off, windows cracked just enough to let in the sound of water slipping past the bank. Mr. Riggs's trailer was tucked behind a chain-link fence, the kind that rattled in the wind even when nothing touched it. I'd driven by twice already that week, never getting out. But this morning felt different, quieter. Like the space between questions and answers had finally narrowed to a single point. I walked up the gravel path slowly, my boots kicking bits of stone with each step. The trailer door was closed, but the window blinds were uneven, bent in one corner. I knocked once, then again. No answer. I stood there a while, just listening. When I finally turned to leave, I heard the soft creak of the door opening behind me. He looked older than I expected. His hair was white-cropped short around the sides, but the eyes were alert, cautious. His left hand trembled slightly as he reached for the screen door latch. "You're Clara," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "You know why I'm here?" He stepped back, motioned for me to enter. The inside of the trailer was stale with the scent of old smoke and mothballs. Stacks of magazines lined the walls. A recliner faced a small TV muted frozen on the Weather Channel. He sat first, sinking slowly into a kitchen chair that looked too flimsy to hold him. "I've got nothing to hide," he said, though he didn't look at me when he said it. I didn't sit. I pulled out the photocopied page from Emily's diary and laid it on the table between us. The handwriting was faint but legible. I think the man who followed me was Mr. Riggs. His truck has the same dent in the door. He stared at it for a long time. "That diary? That's real?" I nodded. "Came from the shelter under Miller Farm. She wrote it while she was down there." His jaw shifted. I could see something building behind his eyes, but whatever it was stayed there. "I saw her that morning," he said, "on Miller Road. I was driving out early, too early for a school kid to be out. She looked spooked, wouldn't look at me, took off toward the barn." "And you followed her?" I asked. "I slowed down," he said. "Didn't stop. Just watched her disappear behind the trees. I figured she was cutting through, maybe late for school. I didn't think anything of it." "But you were on the property," I said. He nodded, finally, meeting my eyes. "Yeah, I was. They paid me to help move the barrels. Said it was nothing dangerous. Just runoff from some testing site. Didn't ask questions. I was 25. I needed money." He stood then slow and stiff and crossed to the sink. Ran the water but didn't pour a glass. Just let it run. "You think about a thing long enough," he said. "You start convincing yourself you didn't really see what you saw, or that you couldn't have done anything different." I asked if he ever saw her again after that day. He shook his head. "Not once. I didn't even know she was missing until they started handing out flyers. I went back to the barn that week just once, middle of the night. Place was quiet, but something was off." I waited, but he didn't explain. He just turned off the water and said, "You should go now." I left the diary page on the table and stepped out into the daylight. The air smelled like rust and river weeds. I didn't look back. That evening I went back through everything Emily's pages, the council rosters, the names Langston had given me, and the photos from the shelter site. It felt like I was circling something just close enough to feel it, but not yet see it clearly. I called Sheriff Collins the next morning and asked if anyone had ever traced the cleanup logs from the creek, specifically in 1981. She hesitated, then said she'd have someone pull the records. When I got to her office an hour later, she handed me a thin folder. "Not much in there," she said. "Most of the early reports were handwritten. Hard to follow the trail. But one name stood out. On a water quality memo from June of '81, lead testing coordinator, Harold Whitmore." I stared at the paper. "The pastor." She nodded. "Looks like he stayed involved longer than he let on. He told me he only saw the dumping once," I said. "That he didn't follow up. Well, either he lied," she said, "or he left some things out." That afternoon, I drove back to the church. It was locked, but the side door to the office wing was open. I made my way through the narrow hallway past the old Sunday school rooms until I reached the records room. I'd been in there once before as a kid on a rainy day when my mom couldn't find a sitter. It smelled the same. Paper dust, something vaguely floral. I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet marked Facilities and Grounds, 1980s, and began flipping through. Most of it was routine maintenance, repainted trim, a new light installed above the altar. But then I found a letter dated April 17th, 1980. It was addressed to Pastor Whitmore from the Briar Ridge Environmental Review Office. The top corner read, "Subject Informal Creek Assessment." The body of the letter confirmed that site conditions along the Miller property indicated recent chemical disturbance. It recommended, though did not mandate, further investigation. In pen next to the margin someone had written "Handled privately, H.W." There was no follow-up, no test results, no signatures beyond his. I sat on the floor and read it 3 times. Then I took a photo and left it exactly where I found it. Back home I told my dad, I didn't show him the photo, I just told him what it said. He closed his eyes and whispered, "She told him. She trusted him. And he still walked away." I asked him again like I had before. Why didn't anyone come forward? This time he didn't say fear. He didn't say guilt. He just said, because no one wanted to be the first. I thought about that for a long time. That night I sat in Emily's room, what used to be hers before it became a guest room, then storage, then just another forgotten space. I opened her journal again, turned past the pages we'd already seen, and stopped on one I hadn't noticed before. It was mostly smudged. Water damage had taken most of the ink, but one line near the top was still clear. He said if I stay here I'll be safe. He promised to come back. There was no name, no context, but it wasn't written in panic. It was written like a child trying to believe something, trying to hold on to hope. I didn't sleep that night. The house was too quiet. The wind pressed against the windows like it wanted to come inside. And I kept thinking if she believed someone would come back, that meant she wasn't alone when she entered the shelter, which meant someone helped her climb down, locked it from the outside, and walked away. Not in fear, not by mistake, but on purpose. And maybe, just maybe, they were still living here just like nothing ever happened. I went back to the church just after sunrise. The sanctuary was still locked, but the side door near the pastor's office gave under gentle pressure. It wasn't unusual. Harold had often said the building should never be sealed too tightly. I moved through the hallway with quiet steps past the hymnals stacked on a cart, the faded bulletin board with leftover pins and curled paper corners. The pastor's office door was ajar. I knocked once, then pushed it open. He was sitting at his desk, hands folded as if he'd been waiting. I didn't speak right away. I just took the folded page from Emily's journal out of my bag and set it down between us. He didn't touch it. He only looked at it and asked, "Where did you find this one?" I told him it had been tucked behind the final few pages pressed close to the spine. Most of it was too damaged to recover, but one sentence had come through. He said if I stayed there, I'd be safe. He promised to come back. I waited, watching his face for movement. It was still, but something behind his eyes shifted. I said, "She trusted you." He looked down at his hands. "I know." I stayed standing. "You told me you left, that you went home, that you didn't know she was still there." He nodded slowly. "That's what I wanted to believe." "But you went back," I said. "Didn't you?" He didn't answer. "You saw what they were doing, and you still told her to hide. Told her to stay quiet." His voice was softer now, nearly a whisper. "I thought it was temporary. I thought once things calmed down I could come back and get her. I even told her that just for now," I said. "Just a day or two. And when the search started, I asked, when the flyers went up." He closed his eyes. "They told me she'd run off, that maybe she'd gone further than anyone thought. I wanted to believe that too." I sat in the chair across from him, the wooden one with the scratch in the armrest I remembered from Sunday school. "Harold," I said, "she was 12. You were the one adult she trusted, and you left her alone in that shelter." He opened a drawer slowly and pulled out a small black book, leather-bound, worn at the edges. A journal. "I started writing everything down," he said. "A year after she disappeared. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her sitting at the bottom of those steps. I thought maybe if I confessed on paper, I could find some peace. Did anyone else know?" I asked. He shook his head. "I never showed it to anyone. Not even the board. I tried once, drafted a resignation letter. Thought if I left, if I made a statement, others would follow. But the church board, they didn't want that. Said I'd drag everything back up. Said I'd be hurting more families than I'd help. And you believed them," I said. "For a long time," he answered. "Long enough for the silence to settle in." I didn't push further. There wasn't anything left to say. Before I left, he handed me the journal. "It's all in here," he said. "What I saw, what I heard." The night Langston drank too much and told me he heard her crying through the concrete. The names, the conversations. I wrote it all down. I took the book without a word and left him there seated in the stillness of that office. Back at the sheriff's office, I sat across from Collins as she read through the first few entries. She said nothing until she closed the cover and said, "We'll move forward with a formal statement. This corroborates what you've already brought in." I asked what that meant. She said charges would be drafted, that Harold would be interviewed under oath, that Langston would be questioned again now with more pressure, Riggs too, and any other names that surfaced through the chain. I thought that would bring relief. But instead I felt something heavier settle in. That night I stood outside the shelter again. The site was cordoned off now, marked for preservation, but I could still see the outline of the concrete frame, the place where the hatch had once been sealed shut. The forensics team had finished processing the space days earlier, but I couldn't bring myself to step down again. Instead, I sat on the grass nearby and opened Harold's journal. I read through entries dated all through 1980 meetings he had with council members, whispered conversations overheard at Sunday services, notes from one particularly tense dinner with my grandfather where he told Harold, "This doesn't concern children. It concerns survival." He wrote about the smell, too, that bitter chemical tang that rolled through the fields some mornings, about how he once followed the cleanup crew to a dumping site just beyond the creek bend where they buried more than just waste. They buried evidence, buried questions. Toward the back of the journal was a list. No heading, no explanation, just names. Councilmen, school board officials, a groundskeeper from the county offices, all names I recognized. Not for what they'd done, but for the roles they played, silent, passive, complicit. It wasn't one man, it was a net, and Emily had gotten caught in it. Sheriff Collins called the next day. Harold had come in just like he said he would, gave his full statement, signed it. She told me that between the journal, the diary, the permit files, and Langston's earlier testimony, the case was moving into federal hands. Environmental crimes, negligence resulting in death, maybe more. Not everyone involved was still living, but enough of them were, enough to face what they chose to ignore. I asked if Emily's body had been released. She said yes. The funeral home was expecting us by the end of the week. We'd need to choose a plot, a marker, a service. I said I'd handle it. My father was awake when I got home. He was sitting in the sunroom watching the wind move through the trees. I told him the investigation had finally shifted, that someone somewhere would have to answer for what they did. He nodded, didn't speak for a while. Then he said, "She loved the song, 'Morning Has Broken.' Used to hum it when she thought no one was listening." I wrote it down. Later that night, I pulled out the photograph of Emily, the one with the bicycle and the blurred figure in the background. I turned it over in my hands, scanning every detail. The man in the hat, the mark on his hand. I still didn't know who he was, but I was starting to think Emily had left him in that picture on purpose, like she knew even then that if someone ever found it, he'd be watching. And so would we. The morning of the service was overcast. Gray light filtered through the windows as I stood in the chapel smoothing the edge of the guestbook tablecloth. We didn't expect many people, just a few neighbors, one of Emily's old classmates who'd reached out when the news broke, and a handful of faces I recognized from the town council meetings. Sheriff Collins came too. She stood near the back, hands clasped in front of her eyes steady. We kept the casket closed. It felt right that way. What they recovered wasn't whole, not really. The pastor who led the service wasn't Harold. He'd stepped down the week before, citing health issues. The new guy didn't know the story, not the real one, but he read the verses I'd chosen without stumbling. And when the music started, "Morning Has Broken," I felt something lift in the room, something long overdue. After the burial, Collins pulled me aside. She said the DOJ had formally opened an investigation into Briar Ridge's 1981 environmental oversight. Multiple interviews were underway. Langston Riggs members of the former zoning board, even a state representative who'd signed off on the waste transport permits. "It's not just negligence anymore," she said. "There are patterns. Suppression of records, falsified logs, maybe even obstruction." "And Emily?" I asked. "She'll be named Collins," said, not as a footnote, as the reason the case is being reopened. I didn't cry. I just nodded. That night I stayed at my dad's. The wind had shifted cooler than usual and the leaves were starting to turn. We sat in silence for a while until he asked if I thought she knew. Knew what I said. That someone would still be looking. That one day the truth would come out. I said yes. I didn't explain why. 2 days later, I got a call from someone I didn't expect Hannah McBride. She'd been a junior at the high school when Emily disappeared, a few years older, lived just up the road from Miller Farm. I remembered her vaguely. We weren't close. She said she wanted to meet in person, that there was something she'd never said out loud. I met her at the edge of the old orchard behind her parents' place. She brought a shoebox. Inside was a stack of Polaroids dated April and May of 1981. "I used to love taking pictures," she said. "Of nothing, really. Trees, deer, my dad's truck. One morning I was up early trying to catch a shot of the fog in the low field. I saw someone dragging a tarp into the woods. I didn't think much of it, but I took a photo. Just one. She handed it to me. It was faded, the kind of grainy blur you'd expect from an old instant camera. But the figure was clear enough. A man. Hat pulled low, right hand marked by a crescent-shaped burn I'd seen before. "Did you ever show this to anyone?" I asked. She shook her head. "My mom told me not to get involved. Said whatever it was, it had nothing to do with us." I looked through the rest of the photos. Most were ordinary. Dandelions, a rusted gate, a crow on a fence post. But 2 of them showed the Miller property from a distance, one with the barn, another with the shelter roof partially uncovered. The same week, Emily vanished. "Can I take these?" I asked. She nodded. "Just don't use my name." I promised. At the sheriff's office, I laid the Polaroids on the table. Collins leaned in, scanning each one. "That burn mark," she said. "Same one you noticed in the photograph with the bicycle." "Same man," I said. "That's 2 independent photos, 2 witnesses, same location, same time frame." She nodded slowly. "I'll send these to the forensics team. We might be able to enhance them." "Will it be enough?" I asked. "To tie him to the shelter?" "Maybe not alone," she said. "But with what Harold wrote and Langston's testimony and now these—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The next morning, I drove out to the edge of town where the cleanup crews had resumed work on the contaminated field sites. The stretch just beyond Miller Creek had been flagged for decades but never fully excavated. Now, under court order, the land was being surveyed again, this time with ground-penetrating radar. I stood behind the yellow rope watching as the machine rolled slowly over the grass, each pass humming like a heartbeat. A technician stepped away to take a phone call. I asked the other, a woman about my age, what they'd found. She hesitated, then said quietly, "There are cavities down there. Man-made, square outlines. One of them's lined in brick." "How deep?" I asked. 3 feet, she said. "Maybe 4. We won't know until we dig." I didn't stay. There wasn't anything more to see, not yet. But as I drove home, I realized I was no longer holding my breath. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the weight wasn't all mine to carry, like the silence was finally cracking. I pulled into the driveway and saw an envelope on my front step. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, clean, no signature. Just one line: "I told you she wouldn't make it out." I read it 3 times. Then I locked the door behind me, drew the blinds, and called Collins. She told me to bring it in immediately. "We'll dust for prints," she said. "Run it through handwriting analysis, even if it's typed. See if anything matches the case files." I handed her the envelope without another word. As I stood in the hallway outside her office, I looked up at the bulletin board where they kept active case timelines. Emily's name was there now, centered, in bold, with red string running from her photo to at least 5 others. She was no longer missing, no longer erased. She was part of something larger, something that would finally have to be answered for. When I left, the sky was the same pale gray it had been the day we buried her. I walked to my car, slowly feeling the cold through my sleeves. And even though I was alone, I didn't feel watched. Not anymore. But I did feel something else. Like we were almost to the end. Almost to the part where the quiet finally breaks open. It didn't happen all at once. There was no final gavel, no press release that tied everything up. Justice came in fragments, some legal, some quieter than that. Sheriff Collins called to let me know the EPA had issued a formal indictment against the old zoning board. 2 of the surviving members pleaded out. 1 confessed on record. Langston was arrested for obstruction, and Harold, he lost his license to counsel, though no charges were filed. He sent a letter before he moved away. It was short. He said he wished he'd done more when it mattered. I never wrote back. The man in the photo, the one with the burn mark, was eventually identified. His name was Thomas Ray Dillon. He died in 2003 out west, never charged in connection with Emily, but he worked for the cleanup crews in Briar Ridge during 1981. Records showed he logged over 60 hours at Miller Farm the week she disappeared. That's as close as we ever got to naming her killer. No one ever found enough to say what exactly he did or how long she'd been alive after she was sealed in. But the implication was enough to reopen the files. Emily's name was formally added to the Registry of Environmental Crime Victims. It wasn't everything, but it meant she'd never be listed as missing again. We buried the rest of the photos with her Hannah's mine, the one of the bicycle. I kept the journal. I don't read it much now, but sometimes I'll take it down just to feel the weight of it. The pages are stiff, marked in places where tears or damp air had softened the ink. When I hold it, I remember how quiet Emily was. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she didn't waste words. And because somewhere deep down she must have known she was already living in a silence too heavy for a child to carry alone. My father passed away last spring, peacefully in his sleep. The doctors said his heart simply gave out. At the service, I read from Psalm 91, his favorite. Afterward, I placed a small photo of Emily in his coat pocket before we closed the casket. I think he'd want it that way, like she wasn't alone anymore, like some part of him stayed behind to keep watch. Briar Ridge still looks the same from a distance. The trees haven't changed. The roads curve the same way through town, but it's quieter now, not just in sound but in feeling. Fewer secrets, more open windows. The old shelter was finally filled in last fall. They held a small memorial on the property, just a plaque and a bench. No speeches, no cameras, just space. Sometimes I sit there when the weather turns cold and I listen to the wind through the grass, to the birds overhead, to the sound of my own breathing. The echoes are still there, buried under years and soil and silence, but they don't haunt me like they used to. Now they remind me why we keep telling these stories, why we say the names out loud. So if you've listened this far, thank you for making space for her memory, for holding on. And if this story stayed with you, consider sharing it so no name gets left behind.